that things could be improved. Concretizing that will help us all then to start to address the gaps. I think that the reality is we are trying to understand where some or all feel there need to be improvements, and the only way to do that is to get a good understanding of the range, where it's happening, how it's happening, and where it's not happening. In addition, I think any kind of exercise to do that, what I heard today underscores for me that it can't happen by one single entity. So this has to be a process where we're going to find appropriate ways to weave in what may, for instance, be partly a mapping exercise coming out of today's session, because we have rapporteurs, which hopefully will help us to have captured all the very good ideas that have been put forward and make sense of it, helping to move this discussion forward. So a major takeaway from today is it underscored that we need to understand better what's going on and what is not going on. I also think that it's very worth exploring how we best use the IGF to progress the mapping exercise, but also the reporting and communicating. The IGF and other inclusive opportunities will give us a good set of opportunities to take stock of where things are, and then also when we look at what is happening or where we see gaps, to have a discussion about how that gap, for instance, could be progressed, how it could be improved. So I would be open to hearing an opportunity for a dedicated slot in the IGF next year, and perhaps that's something that can be brought into the discussions in the preparatory process in February as we take stock of all the work that will be done here in Baku, and we look forward to the next IGF to see how we can create an appropriate space where we can continue the dialogue that started here and perhaps focus even further with a concrete outcome of some kind of mapping of the things that we've been talking about. I would say that from a global business perspective, this enhanced cooperation process must be multi-stakeholder, and the IGF as a space is a natural opportunity to build on in that regard. Thank you.
Thank you. Henriette. Oh. Want to come in?
Got it. Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone for coming today and for the thoughtful responses that we've had so far. Speaking on behalf of APC, I think for me what is really important is that there's a recognition that there's a need to talk about this. The demand from governments for a space to talk about internet public policy issues and their role in making or participating in those public policy issues will not disappear. And I'm not sure how many of you were at the enhanced cooperation consultation in May in Geneva. If you were not, I urge you to read through government submissions. There was not one or two governments who demanded the creation of a new body. There were many. And of those many, there were only a handful that actually emphasized that they believe in multi-stakeholder participation. So this is a very real issue. And if we as a multi-stakeholder internet community don't acknowledge it, we could actually risk losing some of the ground that we've gained. I think also, as has been said today, the range of public policy issues that touch on the internet will only get bigger. So, and this will also create further impetus to this demand. I think the point about diffusion of resources was very important, but that's also part of the reality. The complexity is not going to disappear, so how we deal with it is going to be important. I think that the other reality, and I think Bernadette said it just on the last panel, is that for governments, the effort involved in coordination and in making sure that policies are consistent is also going to become greater. And we heard earlier about the decision made in the Human Rights Council, the resolution that human rights apply on the internet as much as they do off the internet. That, for example, is now a task that all public policy making institutions need to factor into their work. So finding processes where we can talk about how this happens and how it happens with the best possible outcome from a public interest perspective is very important. I think, secondly, this dialogue of taking this process of talking about public policy with governments and governments among one another and governments with other stakeholders needs to be legitimate. And I think we've talked about that. We've talked about what happens when processes that are not considered legitimate are taken forward. And I think, again, this is very important for us to deepen multi-stakeholder participation. I think for governments this is quite difficult, and I think for those of us who are non-governmental stakeholders, we need to recognize that governments find multi-stakeholder processes more difficult than we find multi-stakeholder processes. And I think governments need to consider how they need to change their behaviors, their processes, their thinking. And this is also quite a demanding process. And I think, as has been said by some of the speakers, a good place to consolidate those transformation of governance processes is at home and is at the national level. And I think the more that we have standing, consistent, multi-stakeholder policy-making discussions and forums at a national level, the easier it will become to replicate that at a global level without losing accountability and connection to the national level. And I think then finally, how do we take this forward? I think it's important that this discussion, this dialogue, is willing to do more than mapping and assessment. I think if it sets out only to be willing to take on mapping and assessment, I think that could undermine its legitimacy as well. I think it has to start its work with a willingness to also develop solutions. And I think certainly many developing country governments, and I think many in civil society as well, would feel that unless that process of mapping and assessment is going to feed into more solution development, it would diminish the legitimacy. As for how this goes forward, APC continues to believe that the IGF, and I think as was said by Avery and others, that the IGF is the right space for this. But I also think we can be flexible about how that happens. I think the WGIC format, the Working Group on Internet Governance, is a very good format. It was a working group where participants from different stakeholder groups could participate on an equal footing. And I think such a working group could report to the IGF. It could be constituted by the MAG, for example. It could report back to the IGF, but why can't it also report to the CSTD and into the ISOC process? Why can't we a little bit be more flexible and creative about how we work inside this bigger UN system, which we are part of? And then that brings us to the IGF. And I think we heard comments about the IGF and its capacity to adapt and evolve. And I think, people talk about the evolution of enhanced cooperation. I think we need to really also talk about the evolution of the IGF. And I'd like to see an IGF that's willing to take risk, that's willing to live up to its mandate, to be experimental, to be new, to be inclusive. And to come up with new ways of doing governance and to tackle this complexity and constant transformation within the internet sector with creativity rather than with fear. which I think has been the case at times.
Thank you, Henriette. And now I put on my ISOC hat and also see a little bit our takeaway, but it will be very short. I mean, like others, I have noticed that they seem to have a very strong agreement in this room that enhanced cooperation is about more than just critical internet resources, and it encompasses the whole broad spectrum of internet governance as defined in the Tunis agenda. And also, not surprisingly, in this particular setting, there was a strong emphasis on the multi-stakeholder character of enhanced cooperation. And my third takeaway was the various speakers have made strong linkages, maybe most passionately Avri, to the IGF, and that the enhanced cooperation had lost the home it was originally given by the negotiators, by this what you might call artificial separation between IGF and enhanced cooperation as two separate tracks instead of seeing them as intertwined tracks. And several proposals point to the IGF to further the dialogue in the IGF context and to take it up there in whatever form, and that indeed would be a way forward that we certainly would look at favorably. I'm still not convinced that we do need a separate working group to deal with this rather abstract issue. I think, as it was said in the previous session, that maybe issue-oriented working group to take forward the discussion could be a better way or more fruitful way forward. Also, the reporting requirement has been mentioned, and this is something we clearly could recommend to the UN to be a little bit, shall we say, more regular when sending out letters. ISOC has responded when asked, but I think the last time we've been asked was some 2 or 3 years back, and this is about the only part in the agreed language in the Tunis agenda which is not open to interpretation. That is fairly clear, that it requires relevant organizations. It does not define what the relevant organizations are. It leaves that to the wisdom of the Secretary General, but it does require them to deliver a regular, I think, annual performance report, and this is something we could take back also to the UN leadership to be more active on that. And as to Henriette's proposal for stronger reporting linkages between IGF and CSTD in whatever form, this I think is also something that could be looked into. These are my random conclusions, I would say personal conclusions which need to be digested a little bit more, but I think it was a very rich day of discussions, and certainly we would welcome a continuation of this dialogue in whatever form we decide to go forward. But I would also like to invite our government guests who have missed the last session because they went to the ministerial to give us their comment and their takeaway on how they see it from their perspectives. Heather first.
Thank you very much, Marcus, and good afternoon, everyone. So it's a real pleasure to be here to share a bit of a perspective from the Governmental Advisory Committee at ICANN, and it's interesting to hear that that there is this emerging consensus that that it is important to try to map some of these key activities in relation to enhanced cooperation, and that perhaps we haven't been reporting or communicating progress in the best way that we could. I think this is true for the Governmental Advisory Committee as well. In some cases there has been progress, and I wouldn't say that the GAC of today is really the same one from 10 years ago or even 5 years ago. But it's not well known necessarily. Some of the things that have been developing within the committee and, as I say, some of that progress that's been made. So I would like to provide some sort of examples of that kind of progress. But first, it's important to note that the GAC has a very specific role as part of the ICANN model. And as ICANN is a decision-making body in relation to the coordination of the names and numbers, then the role of the GAC is appropriate to the mandate of ICANN within that particular role. So one of the key developments that I'm happy to report on was that the GAC held a high-level meeting for governments on the margins of the ICANN meeting in Toronto a few weeks ago, and there were hesitations about holding such a high-level meeting. But as part of the overall effort at ICANN to increase accountability and transparency and find ways to strengthen the committee and as working as part of that model, this was one of the proposals that was made in order to reinforce the role of the committee. And so a meeting was held, and it was deemed very successful. And successful certainly in affirming the important theme of preserving and enhancing the multi-stakeholder model. In addition, the high-level meeting took note of progress made as well as identifying priorities for the future. So it served as a good means for capturing those key issues that are relevant to governments that are participating in the GAC. And among those priorities, I think two in particular stood out, and that was the need to continue building capacity for developing countries in order to participate at ICANN, and the other was to ensure that there was sufficient organizational capacity at ICANN to implement the GTLD program, where governments have a range of interests and are impacted by the decisions made by ICANN in relation to that program. So it's a real pleasure to report that there was this affirmation of the multi-stakeholder model, and there was participation from 50 governments as well as a number of observer organizations at the meeting that provided senior officials to participate in that. And in terms of more concrete items that can be reported on in terms of progress in the GAC, we do have interpretation now in the 6 languages of the UN plus Portuguese. So Toronto represented the addition of the last 2 to that list. And so this is a major development for the GAC. We've heard for some times real concern about the ability for government representatives to really properly engage in the discussions where issues can often have a great deal of complexity, and where there's a lot of there are challenges associated for governments participating as part of a broader model where the policy development is initiated outside where governments come to meet, and that's really different from an intergovernmental setting, and so that presents its own set of challenges. But in addition to noting that progress, a couple of points I think are relevant to mention here. And that was related to the GAC's internal mechanisms, and that was to strengthen the GAC's own operations and to ensure that it is effective in being a strong representative of governmental advice within the organization. The other was the recognition of the need to bring quality advice and positions to the GAC, and the importance of the domestic process, which I understand from Wolfgang in the earlier session were one of the recommendations that you made. So it's great to hear that you came to that conclusion as part of your earlier discussions. In terms of globalization, I think some have talked about some of those issues and developments regarding the GAC, but participants in the high-level meeting also affirmed the further development of targeted strategies for regions and noted that there are strategies under development at ICANN targeted to Africa and Latin America. And this is all to ensure that they are aware of discussions and issues that are relevant to them taking place at ICANN. And also noted the importance of fellowships and technical assistance continuing to enhance the way that ICANN conducts its outreach in order to encourage and support broader participation. And then in terms of accountability and transparency and the upcoming review, which was mentioned earlier today, the high-level meeting as well confirmed that it is important to enable engagement of the GAC as early as possible and at various levels within the ICANN policy development process. And Wolfgang tells me there as well that this is also something that emerged out of your earlier discussions. So that's another area of happy coincidence. And the other point that I think is worth noting from the meeting where the improvements are that the importance is that it is important that there be improvements to the financial accountability mechanisms at ICANN resulting from the expansion and the finances associated with the new GTLD program. So anyway, I hope that gives you a sense of the enhanced cooperation that's taking place at the GAC within ICANN. And thank you again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Heather. And last but not least, Alice.
Thank you, and thank you for accommodating us. I come from a region, Africa, that has not meaningfully participated in any of these processes, both ICANN, IGF, for many years. But for the last 3 years, we've had many countries at the national level, building fiber optic cables, increasing participation of many of African people on the internet, and getting many of us there. So internet governance issues are beginning to come on the table and are beginning to become important. Having said that, for us, enhanced cooperation was one, felt like a very abstract term that we really didn't understand what it meant until, of course, it was broken down to what it means to us. And for me, coming from Kenya, it's something we've been practicing for many years. And having come into the IGF pretty late, I think it was during the India IGF, we then made a decision that we were going to engage with the process and also ensure that our region was engaging with not just the IGF processes but ICANN processes as well. It meant beginning to understand what the issues are, even though there's a divide between what our needs are, various stakeholders in the Africa region, and the depth of issues that are being discussed in all of the internet governance related processes. It meant that we needed to start building our own capacity and ensuring that many of us were getting involved in these processes. And what has happened then is we started taking them seriously. A good example is the RRI at the AFRINIC level, the government working group. We've encouraged quite a number of our government stakeholders to be part of that process, to also dispel the facts that are coming up related to the issues coming up related to IP addressing and how we want to address them at the ITU level. The other thing, and the legacy issues, to be able to begin to understand that, and I think that has been one of the most important things, especially from my government, really understanding what ICANN is about, what the IGF processes are about, what are the public policy issues that are related to the internet. And that's why, for example, my government was quite keen to host an ICANN meeting and soon after that an IGF meeting, but also going beyond that, keen to ensure that we have a very multi-stakeholder approach to ICT policy processes. And we went ahead and spearheaded and led that process at the national level. We've had 6 national IGFs that are very good examples of multi-stakeholder approaches and actually enhanced cooperation. The national level also created and established the regional East Africa IGF that again brings all the stakeholders to the table. The only frustrating thing is that when you're dealing with governments at the regional level, it's the frustration of, the IGF really, what does it do? apart from just talking. And several of the ministers from the East African countries have gotten extremely frustrated with it because there's a feeling that it doesn't really do anything beyond just discussing public policy issue, and there's a need to really discuss issues that are important to us, issues to do with interconnection that are now actually being presented as an African common position at the ITU, issues to do with cybersecurity. And I think that is where we need to be careful about in terms of the proposition to have another body that would deal with these issues in a more concrete way. Again, I think going back to what Henriette said, multi-stakeholder processes, the impact is actually felt very concretely at the national level. Other tremendous efforts that have come up to do with even developing positions. For example, in Kenya, just developing a national position for the ITU has meant that the government cannot just sit there and come up with a position. It has to ensure that all the stakeholders are involved, civil society, private sector, and all of that. Granted that sometimes the problem actually has to do with our own civil society not really understanding the issues, or our own private sector not understanding the issues. I'll give a good example of new GTLDs, and even IP addresses. Why are they running out? Why has the US got more? And I think that is where the issue of capacity building comes up, and that's why at the ICANN level and at the GAC level we've made quite a great effort to ensure that we have a capacity building process that's ongoing for developing countries. Also pleased that to the point with the new development of region-based strategic planning. I think for me that's very, very important, and also to ensure, for ICANN that is, for the ICANN process to be specific. And it's very important because for the Africa region it's taken, again, a very multi-stakeholder approach with all the stakeholders sitting on the table and actually developing an African specific ICANN strategy. We will wait to see how that is implemented. It will be interesting to see, and I hope the implementation will also take the same approach, because then again we'll start talking about, governments are not involved or we don't really understand what's going on. So I think that's also very important. The other issue for us is ensuring that even if it's enhanced cooperation, it doesn't actually work for everything, and perhaps being issue-based, that's a lesson we've learned at the national level, very specific issue-based approaches to a specific issue, and then dealing with it to the conclusive end. And a good example for us was the Kenya ICT policy, and also the current development of a national position for ITU, the current development of a national position for new GTLDs from all stakeholders. I think that's important. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And Kenya is a very good illustration of good internet governance begins at home.
Yeah.
Wolfgang misquoted me. I would say good internet governance, not just internet governance. And Kenya really has an exemplary multi-stakeholder process in place. That, I think, explains also the good regulatory environment you have created and the rapid progress you have made. Now we come really to the last speaker. My apologies, Linda. Yes.
Thank you very much. I didn't take it amiss at all. Well, it's no surprise to anyone in this room. You all know our policies very well, but just to reiterate our strong support to the multi-stakeholder model, we think it's really imperative to avoid fragmentation of the internet, but also to avoid disjointed policy making in different corners, and to increase the participation and inclusiveness of all stakeholders from all countries. And that has been said many times this day. I've noted that, not only from Africa but also Latin America and others. But there is also the different levels of enhanced cooperation, or in plural, and that's at regional and national level. And just to remind you that there is also a European body, or not even a body, but there is also this kind of enhanced cooperation going on in Europe in the Eurodig. And the latest meeting was in Stockholm this summer, and we had a pre-meeting together with the Council of Europe. So that shows that this is getting wider and wider, and I think this is clearly the way to go. There is also a number of Internet principles already around that we can be inspired from. The OECD principles were mentioned this morning for Internet policy making, or of course Nelly Kroes's compact for Internet that she presented at the OECD high-level meeting in June 2011. So this clearly indicates some basic precepts to be followed in order to be sure that the Internet develops successfully. Now, we talked a bit also this morning, I made a good note of that, of the OECD and their work going on there, and comments were made about their secretariat. Now, to compare the secretariat of the OECD with what the IGF have, is like comparing a Ferrari to a bicycle, or I could even use a car from the country I know best, comparing a bicycle to a Volvo. But I think it's more a Ferrari than a Volvo, actually, because it's just not fair. And that leads me to the point that this is actually something we haven't discussed that much. It has been mentioned this morning, but that the Secretariat would need to be strengthened. As one of the contributors, one of the big contributors, we would really welcome other stakeholders out there to come up and match, the talk with the walk. Well, I mean, Secretariat is also a question we discussed, by the way, in Toronto a few weeks back for the GAC. But there we now have a timeline and a plan to reinforce the GAC Secretariat. And of course, why am I talking about this? Is this only, the typical bureaucrats' comment? No, it isn't, because if we don't have proper secretarial work preparing our IGFs, we will not advance so much. We will go around the same circles and say what we have said before. So therefore, I'm really hoping that not only will the MAG do splendid preparatory work, but also that the Secretariat would be reinforced so that it could properly prepare the next IGF, which is taking place in a faraway and very nice place, by the way. So this would be one of the main points. And then, of course, I have to plug for our own event. We are actually having an open forum on the 8th, so later this week on Thursday, on enhanced cooperation, and this would allow us to give a formal kickoff to the mapping exercise that has also been mentioned by many this morning. It's plural, mappings, because it's going on in a lot of places. We have received input from Diplo, from APC, from ISOC, and also the Enhanced Cooperation Task Force, among others, for this forum. So, and now we also have, I think, a very, very rich harvest from this day's discussions. I really think it's been very, very constructive and very interesting. So, therefore, I'm forwarding a lot of your messages to that event, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, and allow me to pick up on your comments on the comparison between the IGF Secretariat and the OECD Secretariat. As I said this morning in my brief intervention from the floor, that we had looked very much at the OECD as an inspiration, but obviously we knew right from the beginning we would not replicate the OECD as an organization when we came up with this proposal to have a platform for dialogue. And well, you said Ferrari, we always say the Mercedes in terms of, but in any case, it's something expensive and solid, what the OECD Secretariat is. Yeah.
I just said I was trying not to be Nordic-centered, considering where I come from, so I didn't take the Mercedes or Porsche.
We go in the same direction. It's clear there you have a luxury product, and it's clear also that we knew there would not be funding just available like that. That would be something very, very light. But the inspiration was more the approach as sharing of best practices, as doing, for instance, country case studies and having peer pressure. Yes, negotiations happen in the OECD, but not as a rule all the time. It's when the time is right, negotiations happen. But that's just a small addendum to your remarks. And so, do any of the panelists, would they like to comment on what they've heard so far, or shall we go directly to the floor. Aisha, yes, please.
Thank you, Marcus. Just briefly, I wanted to observe that just listening to the panelists in the past little while has brought out a whole nother set of enhanced cooperation efforts that are going on at various levels. And just wanted to take a second to appreciate that, because I think every time we bring in new representatives from various stakeholders, we start to hear what is going on in various domains, which links to the need for better communicating and reporting, and perhaps further dialogue space to keep understanding what is happening out there. I also just wanted to agree with Marcus about the requesting DESA for a more regular reporting process. I think that would also add to strengthening what I'm talking about in terms of improving reporting. Thank you.
And I just wonder, as enhanced cooperation is a term that was taken from the EU context, whether you could explain a little bit what it means in your context when you use the term.
But it's a foreign policy term that has not much to do with what we're doing here. No, it is a bit confusing for some of our colleagues, I can tell you. Yeah.
Yes, Henriette.
Well, could we perhaps consider a solar-powered glider that has a low footprint and that can fly in many different places? I think just to urge, I completely support the ideas, the points about the Secretariat needing the capacity. And I think just to urge this community to not stop this conversation. We'll have opportunities during our days here at the IGF. There's your event. There's also the Taking Stock session. And I think let's also not lose some of the frankness and some of the debate and some of the passion that we had this morning. I think I feel very strongly that if we use further discussion purely as a placeholder, as a stalling exercise, we risk far more. In terms of legitimacy of multi-stakeholder forums and the strength and impact of the IGF, than we might have to deal with at the level of processing disagreement and conflict and different views.
Okay, thank you. Shall we open the microphone? Comments from the floor? People are tired after a long day of discussions. No passion left, Avri? Remotely, yes. Is there any remote participant? No? Oh, yes, Paminta.
Hello, yeah. Is it working? Okay, so I've just come in because nobody else was coming in. I thought people needed passion. I was a little intrigued also in the morning, but now with the representative from... There is this OECD IGF symmetry or connection being established. I'm not able to understand at all, because OECD is a system which takes in inputs and develops best practices, but also negotiated principles and helps making treaties. It's a full-fledged system, and IGF is only one part of that system, and that part is not very good in the OECD, first of all. But in any case, that's one part of the system, and there's a big part of the system which is missing, which is, since my morning's intervention also said, the enhanced cooperation part. Now, one observation was that, and we need to be talking about that, first of all. Except that there is this view, because I think there's just too much agreement on that things are happening. There is a plurality. Things will take care of themselves. Discussions are enough. There's no need for global internet policy for internet issues. There aren't public policy issues which need somebody to sit and do global public policy issues. I think that diversity is needed. And yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Well, thank you for breaking the ice. That's very helpful. Oh, we have now come up here. Chengetai Masanga from the IGF Secretariat. He was on the list of speakers, but he's only arriving now. So it's a bit unfair as he had to go to the ministerial meeting and we don't want to put him on the spot. But the IGF featured quite a bit in our discussions, and there were many proposals to bring the discussion on enhanced cooperation to the IGF, and also Linda, Director in the European Commission, made also a strong plea for strengthening the Secretariat to support the IGF discussions. But I want to give you time to think about what you have to say. Obviously, I understand, we understand all that you cannot say, yes, okay, let's do it in the IGF. But what is your take on, and how would this work? Would it have to go through the MAG, or would it need a decision by the CSTD?
Just answering quickly off the cuff, I didn't actually hear all the proposals, but the IGF Secretariat or the IGF is constrained by its mandate. So if any of the proposals were outside its mandate, those will have to go through the General Assembly and to change its mandate. So we have to keep to our mandate, because the mandate was a heavily fought thing and each word was debated upon, and so we have to keep within the mandate.
Yes, thank you. Sorry?
Can I just react to Paminda if there's no one?
Okay, well, I'm just a comment on the mandate. We have the original mandate, which is in the WSIS agenda, and there we had quite a bit of discussion today. It's in the WSIS agenda, it's not that clear whether it's separate or not from the IGF. But it's true there are subsequent General Assembly resolutions, and obviously the IGF cannot just ignore General Assembly resolution. So presumably it would need another resolution going through the CSTD process, then bringing the two together again, presumably. But Henriette, you wanted to react? Yes.
I'm not convinced that it would. I'm a MAG member, and I think, as Wolfgang said earlier, there's a lot of openness and flexibility in the IGF. I think if the will is there, and if it's within the mandate, I think we can find a way of establishing some form of working group. But we would have to pay attention to the UN system. I think I just wanted to respond to Paminda. I think what for me was incredibly valuable this morning was that discussion between Ambassador Fonseca and other panelists and members of the audience. And I think that, so I think to look at OECD, IGF, UN, looking at existing modalities and existing institutional frameworks for public policy making among governments, public policy making in a multi-stakeholder way, is part of the mapping and assessment work that we need to do. But I think when it comes to the solution building, we need to be open. I think we need to recognize that governance is undergoing a transformation, not just internet governance. In fact, at this event, we have a forum being organized by the Open Government Partnership. That's new. That's a new thing in the IGF, to have people that are working on government and governance more broadly coming into our internet governance space. And you know why they are here. They're here because they want to learn from our experience and working in a different way. So I would suggest that we are quite open in the solution. I feel strongly there needs to be solution building, and I think that solution building can include having a closed-door government-only day before the IGF, for example, not ministers necessarily, but people that are actually policy-making, to discuss the public policy issues that are relevant to the IGF theme. of that year, for example. Or we could have an event at the IGF where governments come together to discuss the public policy implementation of the Human Rights Council resolution. So I think we can be flexible in solutions, and there can be different types of solutions. But I think if we get stuck in looking at existing institutional frameworks and using them almost as negotiating tools, we're kind of losing the spirit and I think the respect that's needed in finding solutions to what I agree with you and also with Minister Fonseca is a real issue. It's a real issue that governments need to tackle. And I think the reason why it's so important is that we do need governments. I think that's I think the strength and the challenge of multi-stakeholder processes is that if they are not inclusive, they actually don't work.
Thank you there. And institutionally speaking, presumably it could work if we had, like we had in the CSTD, a day discussion on internet governance, have maybe a day discussion we had on enhanced cooperation in CSTD, have that ahead of the official IGF meeting, for instance. But again, I think it's wiser to go through the institutions to have their endorsement. And we all said, I think, the governments find it more difficult than other stakeholders to find their place. So I wonder whether our government representatives, including Linda, would like to comment also on that or think about that. But we have people in the queue, so let's go to the queue first. Avery has found her passion again.
Yes, I found my passion. Am I on? Yeah. So I think in terms of mentioning the mandate, and as I discussed earlier, we have a couple mandates. We have the mandate that was set in the Tunis agenda, and that asked that the UN initiate something. They certainly have initiated something. We have the GA agreements that sort of say, from their perspective, there are two threads. I don't know that we have something that says, thou shalt not talk about enhanced cooperation at the IGF, nor do we have anything that says those things that are discussed at IGF may not be discussed elsewhere. And so I think when we're looking at this issue and we're looking at the IGF sort of saying, listen, there is a home here for talking about things that involve enhanced cooperation, or as the person behind me said earlier, many enhanced cooperations, or as I would prefer to say, a set of enhanced cooperation that contains many things, that there's absolutely no prohibition to actually having those discussions here, even if they continue to be discussed about in the other organizations and, such. So I think to sort of say, what is the mandate here? I don't remember anything in any of the GA decisions that said you cannot do this there. They merely said they saw them as separate. As I say, I think that was in contravention to the recommendations I got from Tunis Agenda. And the UN, and this is something that perhaps I don't know gets talked about much, is I sometimes think that it took a little too much upon itself when it was asked to initiate something by an organization, by many governments in the WSIS process, and decided to actually change what it was that it was initiating. So I do think that there's more of an issue to be discussed there in terms of the UN trying to then curtail what the IGF does. The last thing I'd like to say is bicycles are far more elegant than Mercedes, Volvo, or Ferraris. You just need enough bicycles.
Yeah, Jagaday?
I mean, I don't think the UN is trying to curtail anything as such. The program and agenda of the IGF is set by the MAG, so what the MAG says, the Secretariat normally follows.
There was no single incident that whatever the MAG proposed was not accepted or endorsed. But let's go back to the queue. Bill?
Sure. Bill Smith with PayPal. Just give me a second. First, I want to note, I thought all of today's conversations were quite helpful. And it's a good idea for us to discuss these things. I find it interesting that there is this split, sort of, and a desire to address things separately. I think that we might do better addressing them together, perhaps. Don't know that we can. But I think it's probably obvious, I'm supporting of the existing mechanisms with respect to Internet governance that we have. And that while there may be issues to address in each one of those organizations, be it ICANN, the RIRs, the IETF, the IGF, the ITU, right? There are issues with the organizations. There are issues in those organizations. That's really not, that's not going to help. Discussing those or throwing them out and saying, well, here's a problem here, compare this to that, I don't think is going to move us forward. Questions I have as I listen to these is there's the insistence that we have to have a forum for for internet public policy issues. And I would ask, what are the policy issues of an international nature that must be discussed? Not those of a domestic nature or those where there is a difference of opinion on domestic policy issues, but those of truly international nature where we have to get agreement internationally. So I'd ask, what are those? And if they aren't being addressed in some organization already, well, then perhaps we need to do something. But what are the truly international issues that cannot be decided anywhere already? Ignoring the truly international ones, I hear that issues are not addressed. But I never hear which specific issues, or I shouldn't say never, I rarely hear the specific issues with respect to the Internet that are not being addressed. And these are not issues that I'm stating, not issues that have been addressed or are being addressed, but their resolution is not satisfactory to those posing the question. Okay? If an issue has been addressed or is being addressed, but you don't like the answer in an open multi-stakeholder model, well, you can call for a different organization to decide the issue, but the issue has been decided or is being discussed in the relevant organization. So we can continue to discuss whether this needs to be done a different way or not, but I don't think it's appropriate to say the issue isn't being addressed. From my perspective, many of the issues are being addressed. They're being addressed in many organizations, in appropriate organizations. And so I would ask the people who say we need someplace else to list specific issues and then tell why they are not being addressed in existing organizations and why the existing organizations can't be improved if necessary to address those issues rather than starting over from scratch. Thanks.
Thank you. My answer to that question would be you're right, there are organizations for virtually any issue under the sun, but most organizations don't address these issues in a multi-stakeholder fashion, and that is the problem. They have usually a government-only structure or a structure where other stakeholders can participate as observers. The World Intellectual Property Organization, for instance, starts discussing the role of intermediaries, but then it's governments only. And I think you should be at the table when WIPO discusses the role of intermediaries, for instance. But that's why the IGF is so precious. Here we can discuss these issues in a multi-stakeholder mode. And several speakers pointed out, while no decisions are taken, people listen. And then they say we have to do something about it. But there are two more people in the queue. I don't want to prevent them. Yes, no, but Bertrand was first, yes.
Thank you, Marcus. My name is Bertrand de la Chapelle. I want to make a comment here that is based on my past experience as a government official from France and the thematic ambassador for those issues during 4 years. In that period, I've had the opportunity to participate in all formats to discuss those issues, from the most closed meetings exclusively for governments, to the most open frameworks in the IGF or elsewhere. What I want to give as a personal contribution is the informational benefit that the multi-stakeholder format brings to governments when they participate on topics where there are many facets to an issue. And to be very frank, in most cases where the discussion on the very same issues were taking place exclusively among governments, it was so incredibly easy to fall back on the traditional traps, the G77 versus some European countries, the split between some European countries and others. And you get a situation where the discussion is never on substance. It falls on other political fault lines that have very little to do with the internet as such. Whereas on the other hand, when you're in an environment that is multi-stakeholder, not only do the government officials who participate get to hear the other perspectives on the same issue, what I call doing the painting the elephant together exercise, like you get the economic perspective, you get the social perspective, you get the governmental policy perspective, you get the legal perspective. Not only do they hear other actors, but there are also diverse governmental representatives, data protection authorities, law enforcement authorities, the justice ministries, ministries of industry, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And they all get a way to organize the discussion that they sometimes do not even get at home. It is extremely useful for all of them to be exposed to different positions. And so I speak on a personal basis. It was useful as a government official to have the whole discussion. And I will take an illustration in that regard. The ITU, almost at the same time, set up two different working groups. One in the WTSA, back in Durban 6 years ago, 5 years ago, on internet-related policy issues. It was a closed group, study group at first, just for governments. Almost at the same time, it created another group on IPv6 allocation and adoption, and this one was open to other stakeholders, and particularly the IRRs and the people from the ISTAR community. The dynamics in the two groups were totally opposite. The substantial discussion took place in the open one, and there was a huge educational capacity building and better understanding. On the other discussion, it was only among governments, and we were repeating over and over again the WSIS discussion without moving forward at all. And so this is a pragmatic argument in favor of this interaction, which never prevents government from talking among themselves when there is need to. But this is a practical benefit and not a theoretical or even ideological argument that I wanted to throw into the discussion.
Thank you for that. Wolfgang, you have been waiting for...
Thank you. My name is Wolfgang Kleinwächter. I'm from the University of Aarhus. I think Alice made a point, which is a very serious point and was not discussed so far. She said, you know, for a lot of African governments, the ITU is probably more concrete to match their concrete interests, and the IGF is too vague. I think this we should take this argument very seriously. The IGF is in a competitive situation. You know, there are other forums dealing with similar issues. The World Telecommunication Policy Forum in May next year will be discussed a broad range of internet-related issues. Nobody knows what will be the outcome from the WSIS 10 process, whether, you know, a lot of internet governance-related issues will be discussed in this environment. So that means the IGF has to be, although more attractive, and it has to be more flexible to convince other stakeholders, including African governments, that this is the better place. So we are in a competitive situation. We should not say the IGF is good, we have multi-stakeholder, everything can be done here. So we have to face this competition if we want to continue with the IGF. And if more language is needed from a United Nations General Assembly resolution to make the IGF and the MAC more flexible, then we have governments on the table. Go to New York, the second committee of the General Assembly has now its proceedings, and fight for the language we need to adjust the, you know, the mandate or whatever for the IGF or the MAC. It's done by people, it's done by governments. So that means it's not in stone forever. the mandate which was defined in 2005. The world is changing, and we have to adjust. I think the good thing with the IGF, as far as the community is concerned, it's rather flexible, and the structures have to be also flexible and to meet new challenges. So move forward and do not sit on your chair only. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And there's more to, I mean, obviously, it's also, it's a question of tradition of communication channels. Organization like the ITU communicates directly with governments, and they used to go there. So, if somebody wants to go there, it gets approved by the superior quite automatically, whereas the IGF has more convincing to do. And also, an organization like the EU had much more money at their disposal to fly in and pay attendance fees for delegates and. I mean, back to the resources questions. But, so you have been waiting. Yes, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, I was listening very carefully to everything that was said, and I think I'd like also to intervene, also because I think it was very provocative, the intervention made by the representative of PayPal. One thing I'd like to say as a representative of a government that defends the institution of a new platform for discussion of enhanced cooperation, I'd like not take exactly the question the way it was phrased, because I think it was a very intelligent way to phrase, but it does not reflect the reality as we see it. We recognize the role those organizations, platform processes play, but again, we are talking about organizations, forums, processes that are making contribution in a specialized in a very specific way. One point that I raised in my presentation is that we feel the need to have a comprehensive discussion in which we can make interlinkages between issues. Discussing, for my country, for example, very important to discuss from a development perspective. So when we are discussing not only human rights, we have, of course, the Human Rights Commission, we have WIPO, we have, so you name it. But we think, we feel there is a gap for a forum, a platform that allows for a discussion that refers to many dimensions of this discussion. I think if one problem about the IGF, which we value, is that the IGF does not convey this notion of teeth, of recommendation, of something that can be taken up back. I'll be back in Brazil next week. And what is the input, I'll say, is coming from IGF for public policy makers. It's very difficult to filter. I think I can report on very important discussions we had, but then I don't know. I don't think on a global perspective. And when I sit with other representatives from governments next week, and we can agree on some common message coming from here. So I think this is one of the problems and the reasons why we see the need for a new platform. So I think it was a very intelligent way to phrase, but does not address the point of view of governments as we see the problem. I'd only like also to, I think Henriette has said an important point, that as CSTD, many governments express themselves. So it's not the point of view of Brazil or a group of, I think there are a majority of people from government that have the same feeling. And from the part of my government, and personally, I must say I'm very pleased to be here to listen to this, because I think this is feeding a lot of information. I think the working group, the kind of which we are proposing, is exactly meant for this. So in the end, maybe we'll be convinced by people that think we do not need anything else, that everything is running smoothly. Maybe we can get out of this exercise fully convinced we don't need anything else, that we are wrong in our assessment. Or maybe there will be a place or a conclusion that something else must be added. So this is the kind of exercise we are fully engaged and willing to engage with all multi-stakeholders, because, again, I repeat, I come from a country that is fully committed to the multi-stakeholder approach. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador, also for taking part actively in the discussion. We reflected that governments don't always find it that easy to take part in a rather unstructured multi-stakeholder debate. All the more do we welcome it when some government representatives do, and we certainly do know that it wasn't Brazil's fault that the talks collapsed last May, but we have to recognize we are here more or less among fairly like-minded people in terms of people who approve of the multi-stakeholder approach. Those who don't like it don't even come here anymore, and that's obviously also something we do have to consider. My question would be, though, is it really necessary to have a new body, or can we not use the IGF to fill this gap? As I said this morning, that was what we thought when we came up with the proposal to have this platform for dialogue, that the IGF would fill this gap. Now, I could hear you what you said about the lack of recommendations of traditional outcomes, what you have in a traditional intergovernmental setting, but that is a debate we've had since the beginning of the IGF. But I'm just asking the question. Another government representative would like to add something. Heather, please.
Thank you. I would just like to pick up on one of these points, citing government views expressed in one particular place, and it just reminded me that there really are challenges for governments to coordinate internally, and in addition to hold a multi-stakeholder process. And I think there have been discussions about that today, really drawing that out. But it's really worth emphasizing. If it's challenging or requires a considerable amount of effort for Canada, I'm sure it's the case for other governments as well. And this has really been the primary difference in how we do things relative to more traditional technologies that we've had available for some time. And so we've focused a lot on the institutions, but it's the technology giving rise to these different governance arrangements that we can't lose sight of. So, I mean, the technology works a certain way, and this means that trying to identify a single centralized point it should be difficult, because the technology doesn't work that way. But coming back to the point about internal coordination, there are issues, I think, with presenting consistent views for governments. So depending on which organization that they're going to, and what the particular issue is or aspect of an issue, that it can be challenging to have a coordinated effort and a coordinated position brought forward to those institutions. And so that makes it particularly interesting when you're trying to map efforts under the theme, as we are today, of enhanced cooperation. So, thank you.
Thank you. And also, Linda would like to
Thank you very much. Yes, on the on the role of governments and the like. I mean, the participation of governments and bodies like the one I represent could certainly be improved, but it should be done without strengthening the state's control over the internet resources. And we want to see the future free development also of the internet without any interference whatsoever. So that's very, very important. Having said that, I have personally nothing against, but here I haven't checked this with my authorities, so but I could say that I have nothing personally against the working group if it's multi-stakeholder. Then it's an interesting idea, and I certainly need to bring it back to my bosses. Well, Nelly is coming on Wednesday, but I'm not sure I will get a reply then, to see what they think about it. And it's very clear that organizations who are a live experiment of multi-stakeholderism, it's an ugly word, and global internet governance, they must also live up to the highest expectations of transparency and accountability, and that's something we're telling ICANN from time to time, and they are very well aware of that as well, but just as an input to this discussion.
Thank you. All right. Alice? No?
Thanks. I think I've very little to add apart from saying that for most of our governments, this multi-stakeholder model is actually quite a painful one to accept and to get involved in, because we're used to being in a process where governments make decisions. So having everybody on the table, especially in Kenya, it's actually been a painful process, but a very good one. Having said that, though, I think I'll go back to what I said earlier, that most African governments actually do feel that despite all the efforts at the GAC level and all the, at the IGF level, despite all the great efforts that are being made to involve them, it's still not enough. And I really don't have an answer in terms of who should be responsible. I mean, it's still not enough, and that's why there's leaning towards either coming up with a different organization altogether that allows government to feel that they're engaged, or going to or engaging in processes where governments, developing country governments, feel that they are taken seriously and that they don't have to compete with, for example, the private sector and multinationals, and that the issues that they can discuss at the level where they're at are taken seriously. And I think that is quite a problem, a challenge, actually, not a problem, a challenge for not just African stakeholders and African governments, but also for the IGF and ICANN processes as well, in terms of just ensuring there is equal participation. Yeah, thanks.
These are very valuable comments, and we have started as Internet Society inviting regulators from developing countries to meetings of the Internet Engineering Task Force. And we hear these questions. For them, going to a meeting of an organization like the ITU is a normal thing. They receive invitations, that gets approved by their superiors. They go to the meeting. There's a name tag. You can sit behind the name of the country. You put up your thing, and you can talk, and people listen to you. And when you go to a meeting of the IETF, it's very chaotic. And if you want to be heard, you have to be top-notch. There are top-notch engineers there, and they don't just listen to people who are there based on their competence. It is very egalitarian, but at the same time very aristocratic, because it's a meritocracy. And that can be very difficult to find your way in. That's why we found it important actually to engage with regulators, to bring them round, to introduce them to the leadership of the Internet Engineering Task Force, of the Internet Architecture Board, so they get to know them. They can voice also their concerns, sometimes, usually questions related to access. What can we do to bring down prices? Can we use this protocol to measure traffic? No, you cannot. It was not designed to do that. But this is very helpful to have these one-to-one discussions. And I agree, we should do much more to engage. But and what the IGF can play a very important part in that, because it brings people together. It can be a port of entry for people, especially from developing countries, into the various internet organizations. Well, the NRO is here, that groups all the regional internet registries, and they have a flyer to explain. Quite often you hear questions, where are their meetings? Because you don't automatically receive an invitation as you do with UNESCO, with the ITU. When you're part of the system, there are structures in place. And all these organizations are relatively young. They are teenagers. So it's also a question of growing up, of finding the way. But I think Bernadette in her panel this morning actually made very good remarks on how you have succeeded also in engaging. And your remarks on the multi-stakeholder, it recalls me what your permanent secretary said when I sort of said, I hear you participate in list discussions. And he said, yes, it can be painful, but it helps us make better decisions. And I think this sums it up very nicely. It can be a painful process, but in the end, we're all better off. Other comments? Or are we moving to a wrap-up? There doesn't seem to be any. Yes, Parminder, please.
One thing I heard, and I'm not sure about when they're talking about alternative space or IGF can do, are we talking about doing enhanced cooperation, being what enhanced cooperation was or wasn't meant to, or discussing enhanced cooperation? I'm not very sure, because discussing enhanced cooperation was never a problem inside the IGF. So discussing is something IGF is welcome to do anytime. However, if you say that what is in some people's mind, at least the mechanism enhanced cooperation, if that is IGF, I think they're two very different things, and that thing was getting a little confused in the discussions I heard here. However, if some people said that UN General Assembly seems to be controlling the agenda not to talk about enhanced cooperation, that's again surprising, and Chengetai clarified that they aren't. However, the opposite possibly true, because it was my organization who tried to discuss enhanced cooperation in the IGF, was blocked by a good number of members of the MAG that it should not be discussed. Now, 3 years after that, suddenly it seems to be that the shoe is on the other foot, and I think that's another dynamic I do not understand. Another thing which Wolfgang talked about, going to the second committee and getting IGF changed in the manner we want to change it, but there was a CSTD working group just 6 months back mandated precisely to change the IGF as we wanted to change it, but I was at that IGF working group, and people were not trying to change it, the same people who want to get it changed today. So again, something I'm missing here. Anybody wants to clarify? That's welcome.
Thank you. There's another queue there, please.
Thank you. Оксана Приходько.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oksana Prihodko, Ukraine, European Media Platform. I would like to support your idea to send a personal invitation to governmental representatives from developing countries. Unfortunately, it does not work even now, as we see from the next session, from the neighbor session. But I would like to propose to more actively participate in national IGF initiatives and more active use international organizations with binding mechanism, such as Council of Europe, OECD, and all other. Thank you.
Thank you. Benna?
Right, thank you. I just wanted to continue with the point Alice made there, and the government's wondering, well, why are we just sitting down talking? Nothing is happening. The Caribbean Internet Governance Forum, we create that space for multi-stakeholder engagement, but we also serve as a facilitating organization that helps the private sector, civil society, other interested organizations to get things done so that you see at the end of the day results. So whereas the forum creates the space for discussion, sharing of information, understanding what needs to be done, there is a follow-up mechanism that allows execution. And it is as a result of, for example, the Internet Governance Forum in the Caribbean that we now have Internet exchange points in the English-speaking Caribbean. And that's just one example of what's possible. The talk is necessary, the discussion, the sharing is absolutely necessary, but you can go further with actually executing things that make a difference to the region. Thank you.
Thank you. That's certainly one thing that could be improved, but again, it's also, nothing is ever resource neutral. I mean, we heard about feedback that IXPs were set up as a result of an Internet Governance Forum meeting, but it's more sort of random and here and there. And I think, if you could document it in a bit more in a coherent manner, that would already be a good step. But the way what you described, that is certainly something worth considering. And Bill?
Sure. Bill Smith, PayPal. So for me, and I was very pleased with the ambassador's statements because I intended to be controversial with my statements. I think that was obvious, and I can do that in this forum. But what I hope that this forum allows us to do then is to then sit down at some point and share views and discuss what are, for me, a businessman, right? We see an issue, we want to solve the problem. I'm also an engineer. I solve problems, right? I have a set of resources, I solve a problem, right? Using those that are available to me. So for me, the Internet Governance Forum, both the UN's and the regional or national ones, are an opportunity to sit down and discuss issues openly, frankly, controversially, hear different points of view, and then say, I need to talk with this person, I need to set up another meeting, I need another follow-up so that I understand the real issues, and then we can work towards solutions, whether it is in a single body or done in different ways using existing things. It actually, as an engineer, it doesn't matter to me, right? I just want it done the most efficient way with the resources that I have available. And that, I think, is I find why I enjoy the IGF meeting, is that I'm able to have those conversations and meet new people and solve problems on a going forward basis. It can appear that this place does nothing, right? We just talk. But actually, the talk leads to real solutions.
Thank you. And I think we have to close the queue now, as we want to give also some space to the panelists. Yes, Peter, and then Teresa.
Thank you, Marcus. I just want to react to Parminder's comments about the mandate and about some countries changing their minds. Well, in the working group we have been working on the improvements of the IGF. We had a very clear mandate. And the mandate said that we don't change the basic structure of the IGF. That is, it is not a decision-making body, and it doesn't take resolutions. So it's a forum. And we have followed this mandate, and during our meetings, I think I've started all my meetings just reading out this mandate. Now, if countries wish to change or come up with new ideas, probably they are free to do that. And if the second committee of the GA would like to create some new working group with a different idea or eventually change the mandate of the IGF, it can do that. If it's going to do that or it's going to be something different, this is another matter. Now, as for the follow-up, and I was very, very pleased to hear the comments from my Caribbean friend that we need a kind of execution. And in the working group on the improvement of the IGF, we stood up with a good feeling that there was a consensus, and we managed to have something within the UN, which was a multi-stakeholder group, probably the first time in the UN body, within a UN body. But we haven't made any provisions for the implementational part of the recommendations. So probably from here I would like to make a call for the implementations, and what I have in mind would be a task for the MAG. And just want to share this idea with you, and probably we can elaborate in some of the workshops which will follow in the next couple of days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And now, Teresa.
I just wanted to pick up on two observations that came up in the discussions. One was the point that was made, and I don't quite remember who on the panel, that actually how governments themselves are engaging with their citizens is also shifting in part because of technology. And so in that realm, I think we need to factor that into our discussions in some way, whether in a concrete way or somehow, because there's also been studies, and I think the Economic Forum came out with a very fascinating report on how governments are engaging with their citizens through ICT and through technology, and how that's leading to the emergence of new sorts of partnerships and cooperations in different levels. So I flagged that and put it aside because I think it's relevant somehow to the tone of how we do an assessment, how we do a mapping, how we have this conversation. The second point, though, is that I was struck by a conversation, and I think it was Bernadette who had made it, and then Marcus, you had commented, that we're starting to see the results of certain things that are actually an evolution of the network of engagements between institutions and stakeholders. So whether it's the formulation of IXPs or the formulation of, I think the CTU had done some very interesting internet governance principles or has an ICT roadshow, or whether it's a partnership in some other manner, or the activities that are happening in the Africa region, some of them we can't actually trace and mark, because they are the results of conversations in a hallway that then result in something else. That's actually part of how the internet works, the network of networks. And so how we capture these two elements in this mapping and assessment exercise, I think we need to think about a little bit, because they are relevant to it.
Thank you for that. Yes, indeed, this is something we have been struggling right from the beginning, that we had lots of positive feedbacks, but it's not that easy to document. But I mean, even the conversation we had today, I dare say, would not have been possible 6 or 7 years ago. A very open discussion. We don't agree on everything, but we listen to each other, and we understand each other better. And I think this is already, I think Henriette mentioned the talk in South Africa. No, you did. Talking about talking, yes. And that can be very important, that you first learn to get together. But let me ask all our panelists to make concluding remarks. Who would like to start? Maybe our government guests at the table, and then we end with the co-organizers. Heather? A few final remarks.
Thank you. I wasn't expecting to make further comments, so I'll just thank the organizers for this opportunity today. I think as we continued throughout the day with the discussions, it became more and more clear to me what a welcome initiative it was to create this opportunity. And we've spent a fair bit of time talking about what are the options available to us for having discussions and finding out whether there are gaps, and then of course how to meet them would follow actually assessing that. And so I think this was a very worthwhile endeavor, and thank you for allowing me to come and speak a bit about the GAC effort in enhanced cooperation and to contribute to this broader discussion. So thank you.
Alice?
Mine is also to thank the organizers for having invited us and for these very valuable discussions. At least for me, it's helped me understand what enhanced cooperation is. I mean, it sounded like a very abstract issue, but now understand it, and it'll be good to continue discussing it in the various forums. Thanks.
Linda, would you?
Also thanking very much the organizers. Not least because it has given us a very rich feed to go into the open forum on Thursday afternoon, where Nelly Cruz will be present as well. So all of you, welcome to that. But as I said, I think the work has been very well prepared today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. And now we come to our co-organizers. Who would like to start? Aisha?
I'd just like to say that on behalf of ICC Basis, this has been a very productive dialogue today, and we look forward to continuing this dialogue. I'd also like to underscore that as we in global business have participated in the discussions and consultations on enhanced cooperation since their inception during and post the WSIS process, our views and my members' perspectives on what is needed and what will help move this discussion forward has evolved, and that's because there has been talk and there also has been listening. So I would like to underscore that there's a really productive impact from the range of views that we hear and how we absorb it and how we come back to try to help be a productive member of this community to move the discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Henriette?
Thank you. I support Aisha's comments. I think it's been a good day. There's been some reflection, there's been some debate and some disagreement, and I think there's been good ideas. And I really would like to see emerge from this not just more dialogue in the IGF. I think, of course, I want lots more, but I would like to see a working group that's fully multi-stakeholder, that does not have to negotiate its report, or for its report to become the product of negotiations among governments. The report must be its report, and I'd like to come up with proposals as well as doing mapping and assessment. And I would not like to preempt the outcome of those potential proposals at this point. I think that's why one does mapping and assessment. And then I'd like to see an IGF that becomes a launch pad for spin-off processes that do develop recommendations that stakeholders, including governments, can take away with them and work with. It doesn't have to happen in the IGF itself, but the IGF can be the platform that gives rise to those processes.
Thank you. And well, that gives me the last word. I would also like to add my voice of thanks to both the co-organizers and to the governments of the former IGF host country, Kenya, Brazil and Egypt, to have given us their support and to have participated actively. I also agree that I think we have evolved, we have had a good discussion, and I think we said, I think the heading was from deadlock to dialogue, and we had this dialogue. So we're over the deadlock. We can talk to each other. I don't think we have a broad sort of emerging consensus on whether or not the working group, but our position remains the same. We don't exclude a working group at the end of a continued process of engaging in dialogue. But right now, I think we can certainly say we had a good and rich day of discussions, and let's take the dialogue forward. And we have more opportunity to discuss it during this week's IGF, and maybe we have evolved further at the end of this week. With that, I thank you all for attending and remind you we have the reception. ISOC is hosting at 7 o'clock. The address was given in the invitation, Caravanserai, also something in the Old Town. It's close to the Google reception, so you can hop from one to the other. Okay, with that, I'd like to thank you all for attending our meeting, which I think has in true IGF tradition been an outstanding success.